Shri Ram Madhavji, who has organized after a period of 2 years another fantastic India Ideas Conclave, Mr. Shaurya Doval and other colleagues from the India Foundation, distinguished speakers who have participated so far and who will be participating, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. I must commend once again the India Foundation for organizing such a wonderful conference focused on the theme that is really important for us as we look to the future, which is what will India 2.0 look like, or as Anand Nageshwaran was saying, maybe 3.0 or 4.0. But in any case, the question is, what is the next India going to look like? And it's absolutely appropriate that we are having this discussion in Bengaluru, which is India's most futuristic city, where a lot of India is being reinvented and rethought. And I think Anand Nageshwaran gave me the perfect segue. He gave me the perfect segue because he talked about a responsible India. He talked about an India where we have to really take into account the very significant challenges that we are facing. And the challenge that I want to talk about is about climate change. And it is about how India must become a net zero economy. And when Indians talk about net zero, or we talk about decarbonization, the thinking always is that it is somehow incidental to development. That development is on one side and decarbonization is on the other side. And what I have been arguing for several years, and I very strongly believe it, that decarbonization and the pathway to net zero and development should be fused together. That they belong together, and that India is going to forge a unique development model that is going to decarbonize and develop at the same time, and that in fact is our path forward. So with that, let me start with the presentation first to tell you a little bit about how we have to deal with the process of climate change. Can I get the presentation up on the screen? Is that possible? No, I think we are too far back. So we have to seize the climate movement. This is very important, not just because the world has to get to net zero, but because we also have to really accelerate our development and deal with some of the challenges that climate change is bringing to us. And the three messages I want to lay out in front of you today is that climate change is upon us. It was so refreshing to land here in Bangalore and to see the rain, because I'm coming from Delhi and Hazaribagh, where we've had this incredible heat wave, and to come to this very pleasant city and to experience the rain tells us that, already the impact of climate change is upon us. And the good news is that net zero is net positive. Most people, when they think about net zero, think that for some reason it's going to be net negative, that it is going to harm our development, that it is bad for our development. That's wrong. And I'll show you net zero is net positive. And we have a historic opportunity because of our G20 presidency. The Honorable Prime Minister has already shown great statesmanship with the International Solar Alliance. We now have an opportunity to create a global climate alliance that, quite frankly, and I say this without any hint of exaggeration, quite simply will enable us to save the world. That's what the stakes are right now. It's really one of those existentialist moments for humanity, and India must seize the moment. So we know, and if you can see this here, you will see that I'm laying out what has been happening to carbon in the atmosphere. Those of you that are tracking it know that we have just crossed 420 parts per million. 420 parts per million. This has not been seen before in human history, and we are literally off the chart. So carbon parts per million, and of course those of you who understand how global climate change, global warming happens, know that when we put carbon into the atmosphere, it's like creating a blanket around the earth. So when you are cold in the winter, you put a blanket around yourself to trap the heat. That's what greenhouse gases do. सो विद ग्रीन हाउस गैसेज आप समझिए कि सर्दियों में आपने एक रजाई ओढ़ ली है और रजाई के कारण आप गर्म होते चले जा रहे हैं, लेकिन अब पृथ्वी गर्म हो रही है. दैट इज व्हाट इज हैपनिंग. And as a result of that, the scientific consensus on this is very clear. Since the industrial era, we have already warmed up by 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's why we're getting 45-degree temperatures in Delhi in April, which we've never experienced before. और मैं सब लोगों को बताता हूँ कि जब मैं बचपन में हजारीबाग में रहा करता था, झारखंड में, क्योंकि हरियाली हमारे आसपास होती थी, हमें पंखे की भी ज़रूरत नहीं होती थी. और आज आप हजारीबाग में रहेंगे तो आपका एसी से भी काम नहीं चलेगा. इतना बदलाव हो गया है. दिस इज द टेम्परेचर चेंज दैट वी आर ऑलरेडी एक्सपीरियंसिंग. एंड व्हाट द साइंटिफिक कंसेंसस इज टेलिंग अस इज दैट though we've already hit 1.5 degrees temperature warming, we are likely to perhaps go anywhere between, let's say, another 1.4 to 4 degrees centigrade. The scientific consensus right now is 3.2 degrees centigrade. So by 2100, and Anandji was talking about our children and our grandchildren, we won't be around, but our children and our grandchildren will experience an India that has warmed very, very much. So average mean temperature for India is 25 degrees centigrade. Again, if you look at the numbers, people are saying anywhere between 25 to almost 30 degrees centigrade. Which means that Delhi, which is experiencing 45 degrees, is going to experience 50 degrees centigrade as the max temperature. 50 degrees centigrade. So we have some very major climatic changes coming up. We know obviously that when we get this kind of extreme weather, we get more cyclones, we get more floods, we get more droughts. All of these extreme events are becoming 4 or 5 times more frequent than they used to. We've already experienced a terrible heat wave in northern India. It was 45 degrees temperature in April, May, which again meant that we had experienced the warmest March on record and the warmest April on record. In 122 years of record keeping, 122 years of record keeping, we had the warmest March, we had the warmest April. And the most difficult thing on this is that our energy systems, our power grid is not set up to deal with this. We get massive peaks in the afternoon and the evening when the temperature goes up. And I can tell you, when I'm in Delhi, we may have a power outage for a half an hour or so for a little while. But when we are in Jharkhand, जब मैं हजारीबाग में रहता हूँ, मैं आपको बता भी नहीं सकता हूँ कि कितनी हम लोगों को दिक्कत होती है, कितना कष्ट होता है. क्योंकि बिजली 6-6, 8-8, 10-10, 12-12 घंटे नहीं रहती है. किसी भी तरीके से हम लोग वो बिजली का जो डिमांड है, हम लोग उसको पूरा नहीं कर पाते हैं. इवन आर इन्वर्टर्स फेल. हमारे इन्वर्टर भी नहीं काम करते हैं, क्योंकि इन्वर्टर के लिए थोड़ा समय चाहिए टू चार्ज इट अप. But we are just not getting enough electricity at a high enough voltage to keep our inverters going. Jharkhand is suffering right now a 25% difference between the amount of electricity that we have versus the supply that we have. And there are several other states that are going through this right now. So climate change is affecting us now. And in the future, it's just going to become even more dramatic in terms of the challenges that we have to deal with. So here's another aspect of climate change, which is flooding. So already we are seeing that sea levels have risen by about 10-20 centimeters. As time goes on, by about 2100, there is a sense that sea levels will rise by anywhere on average. An average, you can cross a river and drown, even though on average it's below your height, because there's a lot of variation that's hidden here, and I'll come to that in a second. But on average, people are expecting at least a half a meter rise on the sea level around the world. But what does that mean specifically for India? If we look to our major coastal cities, you look to Mumbai, you look to Kochi, you look to Calcutta, all the modeling and simulation is telling us that we can experience very catastrophic consequences. And then when we have a cyclone which leads to a storm surge, in a cyclone we can have a storm surge, ladies and gentlemen, of 2 meters, 3 meters. So when we are already experiencing higher sea levels, then we get a storm surge of 2 meters, 3 meters, we could end up in a situation where some of our major cities will find themselves underwater. This is what climate change is likely to do to us. This is already at some level baked in because we've already put the carbon in the atmosphere. 420 parts per million is already in the carbon. हमने रजाई ओढ़ ली है और धीरे 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 पृथ्वी जो है वो गर्म होती चली जा रही है. This is what is happening. Now, what does this mean for agriculture? We are already experiencing a situation, Anandji will be most interested, where our food prices are going up, inflation is going up because food prices are going up. But what happens when our agricultural districts suffer this kind of stress? What the research is again showing is that we are going to, at this stage, if we don't make the necessary changes, see reduction in our yields as our agricultural districts deal with both heat as well as drought. So our agricultural yields are going to be impacted, and we have to think very carefully about what happens to our food production, and not just in India, but around the world. Africa is going through a major drought and a major famine type situation right now. Already the UN Food and Agriculture Organization is saying that hundreds of millions of people are at risk of very severe hunger and famine conditions. We also know that when we induce these kinds of climatic pressures around our South Asian neighborhood, that it results in some very serious migration challenges. In India, people will migrate. There are worries in Sri Lanka because that's going to experience quite a lot of coastal flooding, and of course in Bangladesh as well. So these are very, very serious issues. And India seemed very unlikely to reach net zero. We seemed very unlikely to reach net zero and to start to deal with these climate changes. We were on a baseline that was going to take us from 3.5 billion tons of carbon emissions to 7 billion tons. The world is trying to get to net zero. Today we are emitting 55 billion tons of carbon every year. That's how we've got to 420 parts per million. And of that 55 billion tons of carbon equivalent emissions, India is emitting 3.5 billion tons, about 7%. Today we are emitting about 7% of the greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere. The world has committed to hit net zero sometime in the mid-century, 2050, 2060, 2070. But the current baseline that we were on was going to take us to 7 billion tons. If the world is going to zero, India can't go to 7 billion tons. It's just not going to be tenable. And that's when the Honorable Prime Minister in Glasgow made a very historic announcement where he said that we are going to go to net zero by 2070. So let me just bring that back. So net zero. So instead of continuing on this trajectory, instead of going on this trajectory, which would have taken us to 7 billion, this doesn't include agriculture, by the way, that's the difference. Instead of going to 7 billion, we have now said that we are going to go to net zero by 2070. We are going to be on this trajectory. This is based on some very, very sophisticated modeling that we've done. And this is the decisive decade where we have to put in place the policies that will enable us to get there. Now, I'm going to go through the next charts very quickly because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. But the basic point to take away here is that net zero, all the modeling, all the economic work that we've done, and I've been doing this for 3 years with some of the best experts, modelers on the planet, all the modeling work is telling us that net zero will be net positive. That's great news. That means if we get on the decarbonization path, if we get on the net zero pathway, we're going to grow GDP. We are going to increase the number of jobs that we would have seen on our baseline. So we are going to create more jobs. We are going to reduce air pollution. Air pollution, we are losing 10 to 20 lakh people a year simply because of air pollution, and the bulk of it is coming from fossil fuels. So net zero is net positive in terms of air pollution. Today we are importing $200 billion a year of fossil fuels. When we go to renewables, we don't have to import fossil fuels anymore. We're going to save a tremendous amount of money and really improve our current account, Anandji, when we switch over to renewables. So net zero is net positive. Now, And Prakash ji is here from the Asian Development Bank. The economic intuition, Prakash ji, is very simple. Why is net zero net positive? Because we will have to invest trillions of dollars to switch our economy to being a green economy. Now, when you invest $2 or $3 trillion, hundreds of billions of dollars a year into more efficient technologies, which is what green technologies are, guess what? You're going to grow the economy. It's very simple, actually. It's very simple. You invest hundreds of billions of dollars into more efficient technologies, obviously you're going to grow. That is why, ladies and gentlemen, you really didn't need all this modeling to prove the very simple point, and that's my big headline. Net zero is net positive. Net positive for India. We have to do this. But there's always a big catch. The catch is we need those hundreds of billions of dollars. That's why, of course, we have Prakash ji from the Asian Development Bank and all the other multilateral institutions that will get us those trillions of dollars that we need to get to net zero. But what we really need is a climate alliance. And Honorable PM Sahab said exactly the right thing when he went to Glasgow. He said, हम लोग net zero करेंगे, पंचामृत की उन्होंने बात की, हम लोग net zero करेंगे, लेकिन साधन आपको देने पड़ेंगे, यानी the capital has to come from the global north so that the global south can be on the net zero pathway. If we have to invest incrementally trillions of dollars, we need a global climate alliance that can mobilize that capital and bring it to India and other countries of the global south. That's the rub. That's what's very important. And that is what we need to do. We need a strong climate alliance. I'm again not going to get into the details of how we need to create a climate club. But all the economists, and Professor Nordhaus, who's won a Nobel Prize for thinking about these issues, has correctly pointed out that the reason why Paris and other agreements don't work very well is because we have a big free rider problem. The US walked away from Paris. The US just walked away from Paris. They said, नहीं करेंगे, क्या कर लोगे? क्या कर लोगे? नहीं करते. So unless we draw a line in the sand, एक लक्ष्मण रेखा बनाए कि जब तक free rider penalties हम लोग नहीं लगाएंगे, till then we are not going to have effective climate alliances. So we need a climate alliance. There have been various ways of trying to do this. Again, I'm not going to get into the details, but there is a solution space for creating a climate alliance. And that solution space uses the market, and its equity, climate justice is reflected in that. Once we can balance out climate justice and a market-driven approach, we can find a solution space. We can create a climate alliance that can work. And for that, we have to mobilize financial institutions around the world. We have to get hundreds of billions of dollars to flow through them in a market-driven approach. And that's how, ladies and gentlemen, we can develop India, we can decarbonize India, both at the same time. And therefore, as I said, very dramatically, we can save the world. Because we cannot continue on the trajectory that we're on right now. You know, carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions are actually increasing. Because of the crisis that we have in the Ukraine right now, we've had to move to coal, we've had to burn more fossil fuels, and it's resulting in even more carbon going into the atmosphere when we should be cutting back on carbon. India has shown that we can put together alliances like the International Solar Alliance. We now have a historic opportunity. Our Honorable Prime Minister is viewed by everyone as a global statesman. He has the credibility as the leader of the global south, that we bring the global south and the global north together in a global climate alliance, which is a strong alliance, an alliance where sufficient capital is flowing from the global north to the global south, and there's more than enough capital available to do that, where we can save India and save the world. Thank you very much. That is Hawaii. We must seize the climate moment.